Okay, welcome back, everyone. Good to see you all. Thank you very much, Congressman Conyers. As you all know, he's been a fantastic champion of the Second Chance Act, and there will be a quiz on all the bill numbers that he referenced by the end of the session. So, very excited about this next panel that we have here at this plenary session. It focuses on something that at the end of the day, I think we all agree is what will make or break a reentry program, and that is that partnership with local government and local and community and faith-based organizations. And I am so excited that we have a very high-profile official in the administration to kick off this panel, and that person is Roy Austin. Roy works for the Domestic Policy Council at the White House. Roy's a good friend. Roy has just been an amazing ally. I first connected with Roy in his position at the White House, I think it was about a couple years ago. Roy did something that I think any of us in the audience would really appreciate, we really like, and we don't always expect. He just asked me to tell him what I thought was important and what needed to happen, and then he listened. And I think we all like to be listened to. And so that was a real treat. It was a really impressive experience, and I would have come away satisfied just with that alone. But what followed was truly amazing. Roy listened to a lot of the things I said, and he smiled and nodded, and he said, I think you're going to be really pleased with some of the things that are going to happen over the next 2 years. And Roy, what's happened over the past 2 years has just been nothing short of amazing. I think we've all been incredibly impressed with what the president has done in such visible ways on this issue, whether it's been in his addresses to law enforcement communities or to the NAACP or in his visit to a prison. But for those of you who work behind the scenes in so many programs, get the magnifying glass out in some of those photos or zoom in on your iPhones, and in the background you'll see Roy Austin in those pictures. He can't take credit for anything that's happening. He will appropriately tell us about the incredible leadership of the president, but for those of us who work in the trenches, we all know we have Roy to thank for so much of this great work. He used to work in the Civil Rights Division. We're thrilled to have him where he is now. Roy, thank you very much for all you're doing. I turn it over to you.
So for those of you who know Michael, I mean, I really couldn't get a word in edgewise, is why I was listening so much. He just went through this really long list of everything that the Council on State Governments was working on, and he said, Roy, we need to make this stuff happen. But truly, Michael, these past couple of days, your years of work on criminal justice reform, it is good to see so much movement forward, but so much of it is owed to you and to the amazing work that you've been doing for so long on this issue. So as I stand before you, I have about 400 days until the weekend. And what that means is we have about 400 more days of President Obama's administration. And he has made it very clear that he wants us to run through the tape, that he expects every single day to be a day made to make this country a better place. And one of his absolute passions is criminal justice reform and seeing what we can do on criminal justice reform. So let me talk to you about kind of 4 different areas very quickly, because really it's a chance for you to hear from the people who are doing the real work on the ground. So first, the number one thing for reentry is really no entry. We have to keep people from going into the system in the first place. And so what I would recommend to you and what I would ask of you is that you really take a look at some of the things that we have talked about in the White House and get this pushed out to all of the communities, all of the states, all the places where we really have to deal with the 2 million people who are currently incarcerated, not the 200,000 people who are incarcerated in the federal system. So the first thing is school discipline. Okay, we have to stop putting our kids into the system based on being kids, based on doing the same stupid stuff that we did. We have to stop that. And there is something called school discipline guidance that was put out by the Department of Justice and the Department of Education, which helps teachers and administrators understand exactly what they could be doing to stop putting kids into the system in the first place. Because once you take a kid and you suspend them, and we have 3 million kids who are suspended out of school or expelled every year, 3 million kids. Those kids are the ones who are later going to end up in our juvenile justice system and in our criminal justice system, but we can stop it right there. We can stop it right there by, you know what the punishment for being bad in school is? More school. You got to keep them in the classroom. You got to find ways to put them in school suspension where you do extra math and extra English, and you really work with these kids so that they don't end up in our system. So what I'd love for people to do is to take that school discipline guidance, take it to your school board, take it to your mayors, take it to your school administrators, and say, are we doing these things? Because if we're not doing these things, then we're adding to the problem. And so that's one thing that I would love for you to do. Another thing that I'd love for you to do is our law enforcement officers actually want to help. They want to be part of the solution here. And one of my colleagues, Susan Dozier, is here in the front row, and she brought to the White House a group called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, or a program called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. And what this does is it takes people pre-booking and sends them to the kind of counseling and help that they need so that they never have to end up in the system in the first place. And this is police officers working closely with public defenders and prosecutors, because we realize that so many people who end up in the system in the first place for something silly, something small, really just need some help. And if we can just provide them with that help in the first place, that's going to get them in a much better place. So I really recommend that you take a close look at LEAD. The city of Seattle is one that has implemented it the most, but Santa Fe is working on it. Albany is working on it. I've heard that Maine is working on it. But this is an incredibly important program to keep people out of the system in the first place. The other thing is the president created a task force on 21st century policing to talk about police and community relations and how we have to improve these things. If we improve police and community relations, we're not going to have police officers who feel like locking up people for small things is actually what their job is. And if we improve these and we have that conversation, it'll be incredibly important. And so there are about 59 recommendations. Again, here's another document that shouldn't be sitting on the shelf gathering dust, that it would be great if you guys took to your police department, took to your mayor, and said, are we doing these things to make sure that our police and our communities are working together on all of these things? Because guess what? Police are part of that same community. Guess what? We'll be more safe if, in fact, the community trusts the police officers. We will have fewer people incarcerated if people believe in law enforcement and believe in the rule of law. And that is part of what can be done if we follow what's mentioned in the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Another colleague of mine is in the room, and that is Jenny Katzman. And Jenny Katzman recently did a convening on fees and fines. Okay, we have criminalized poverty. We have said that if you are poor and you cannot pay, then eventually what we're going to do is we're going to lock you up. And if we don't lock you up for not paying, what we're going to do is we're going to fine you. We're going to double that fine in a month or so. And then, because what really makes sense is, let's boot your car so you can't get your job. Okay, and that's what we're doing in communities around the country. And this is a real big problem, and we need to end it. And we need to find ways to be regressive in the way that we are fining and giving people fees. We need to find a way to make sure we're not criminalizing the people who are already hurting in the first place. Because once again, you put them in the system, then we end up having to talk about the reentry that so much of us are talking about right now. Instead of that, let's help them on the front end so they don't end up needing that kind of help on the back end. And talking about that, we also have bail. So these fixed bail policies where we tell somebody, oh, well, you know what, you're poor and we arrested you, so let's lock you up. Okay? Not because you're a flight risk, not because you're a danger, but because you can't pay to get out. We currently have 450,000 people in our jails who have not been convicted of anything. 450,000 people out of the 2.2 million people who are currently incarcerated. That number should not be there at all. There are not that many people who are dangerous or are flight risks. So we need to go back to, or you need to go back to your state and local governments. We need to keep talking about this, about how do we make sure that when we are giving somebody a money bail, it is because they are a flight risk or because they are a danger. And beyond that, let them come back to court on their own recognizance. So I know I only have a little bit more time, but let me just talk about data. Okay, because this is something that is so incredibly important and something that we just do wrong all the time. Our criminal justice data is awful. Okay? Our fantasy football data is amazing. All right? Absolutely amazing. But our criminal justice data, awful. How do we know that your programs are working if we don't have the data right now to find out? How do we make sure that we are getting that data? So we have something called the National Incident-Based Reporting System, which is a more robust way of collecting criminal justice data. We need every location, every jurisdiction to take this on and to make sure that they are providing the data so that we can talk about national trends. So when we have New Jersey talking to Montgomery County, they can say, hey, this is working in our jurisdiction, what's working in your jurisdiction? But we right now don't have the numbers to do that on a national level. So it'd be great if you did that. The other thing we have is something called the Police Data Initiative. And the Police Data Initiative is we challenge law enforcement to put their data online, to open it up, be more transparent about it. And so there's right now a website being run by the Police Foundation that's talking about putting data online. Right now we have about 28 jurisdictions that are doing it. There's no reason why every single person in this room or every single jurisdiction represented in this room doesn't have every single bit of its criminal justice data online. Because it's not the police department's data, it's not the mayor's office's data, it's the community's data. And the community should have a chance to see that. So I see that my time is up, and I would love to sit here and talk to you guys forever because there's a lot going on for the next 400 days. But what I really want to say is the work you're doing is amazing. It's absolutely amazing, and it could not be more important because we do not have a wasted American. We do not have a wasted person in this community, in this country. And so thank you for believing in that and doing the work that needs to be done on that every single day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roy. So I mentioned early on when we started this panel that we keep talking about reentry at the end of the day being an issue about communities, because when people come out, they return to their homes, they return to families, they return to communities. And really, for a reentry program to succeed, there has to be that partnership with community. And when we talk about partnership with community, we're talking about your relationship with lots of key local leaders. And that's what this panel is going to be about. And I'm going to queue up our first poll question that we asked you earlier. We asked you earlier, how would you characterize the involvement of local leaders in your program? If we can show the results to poll question 9. Go ahead and show the results to that. And you can see here, significantly involved, about 20%, somewhat involved, a little over half, not involved at all, about a quarter. And so I think that's about consistent with what many of us, I think, probably on stage would have expected. And it's that somewhat involved percentage, right? That's tricky, right? I've talked to some folks, but I haven't talked to everybody. Maybe in some cases I've talked to enough folks to know I don't want to talk to any more folks locally, because I'm only getting into hotter and hotter water, right? That's what we're going to start to probe with this terrific panel. And let me introduce the panel that I have up here. First, starting right to my left here is Reverend Jeff Brown. Reverend Jeffrey Brown, he is the president of RECAP, which stands for Rebuilding Every Community Around Peace. That's a national initiative that assists cities in building better partnerships between faith and community-based leaders. Many of you may know about what many of us call the Boston Miracle and what happened there, and Reverend Brown was a key leader in that. He was one of the co-founders of the Boston 10-Point Coalition. That was a faith-based partnership with law enforcement, with community leaders, that helped achieve that record 80% decline in violent crime in Boston. Sitting next to Jeff Brown is Jim McGreevey. He is the former governor of New Jersey, and as a resident of New Jersey, I will tell you that our version what you saw yesterday with Van Jones and the COO, Mark Holden of Koch brothers at this table. The New Jersey version of that is Governor McGreevey and Governor Chris Christie hugging it out at a reentry program in Jersey City and in Newark, where Governor McGreevey works. Many of you will know, given their politics, Governor McGreevey and Governor Christie not necessarily agreeing on everything, much at all. On this issue, though, they really do agree on exactly what we're talking about, and he has been instrumental in bringing key people to the table on reentry. We are thrilled to have him. He certainly knows local politics quite well, having been a local elected official in Woodbridge, one of the largest municipalities in the state of New Jersey. So thank you, Governor McGreevey, for joining us. Sitting next to Governor McGreevey is Tim Warner. Tim Warner is the Chief Engagement and Partnership Officer in Montgomery County Public Schools. He's worked for about 5 years in the County Executive's Office of Community Partnerships as the liaison for the African American and faith communities. He's won numerous awards from national associations. He really has a good handle on how to navigate those partnerships between government and between community leaders. Thank you very much, Mr. Warner, for joining us. Next to Tim Warner is Michael Daniels. Michael Daniels is the policy director to Commissioner Marilyn Brown, who's the chair of the County Board of Commissioners in Franklin County. Ohioans also know that as Columbus, Ohio, one of the biggest counties in the state of Ohio. We are thrilled to have Michael with us. He will talk about how the county commissioners have really been engaged in this and how they can help sustain a lot of the programs that you all are working on. So please join me in thanking this terrific panel as we start to launch this discussion. So as you can imagine, being incredible leaders and dynamic, I'm sure each of these terrific individuals could grab the microphone and talk for a good hour on the fantastic things they're doing. I've told them that I am going to be pretty abrupt. I hope they don't mind. We're going to do this as kind of a bunch of questions and answers, and they've told me they're game for that, and so I thank you in advance for that. I'm going to start with just ask you to give me a super quick overview of the work you're doing in this particular space of reentry, just so people have an idea of the particular effort you're leading in your community. We are going to keep it on a tight time frame of just a couple minutes, but Reverend Brown, you'll start. Go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. They said I only have 2 minutes and I'm a Baptist minister. Takes me about 15 minutes just to clear my throat. You know? But I think that the role of faith-based institutions in reentry is a critical one. I've been a part of our effort in Boston called the Boston Reentry Initiative, was one of the founding partners in that particular coalition. And I have many, many extraordinary stories of faith groups who have really embraced many of the young people who have come home, who are preparing to come home and ready to face their tomorrows with a lot of questions, but to have a community of people that would embrace them and would love them unconditionally is important. I also know that in the work that I'm doing is that when we talk about all levels of violence prevention and intervention, that faith communities can also play a key role. Part of the work that I'm doing is bringing together faith-based groups and with sectors of the city and law enforcement, working directly on the streets to reduce violence in the communities. That also means you have to engage faith communities in reentry work. And it's a critical piece of what we need to do. How's that for a Baptist?
Wow, that was an undertime. Governor, that's a high bar to set. Governor McGreevey heads up the Jersey City Employment and Training Program. Governor, a little bit about the program you lead there.
Yes, Michael, I just want to say thank you to you and the CSG Justice Center. Our program, and Frank Mazza and Director Villas are here from Jersey City and Hudson County. We're in Jersey City, Newark, about to be in Patterson and Toms River with something called the New Jersey Reentry Corporation. And basically we have 5 points. One is addiction treatment, addiction treatment, addiction treatment. That is 70% of the people that are behind bars or are actively engaged in their addiction, so it's treatment. Second is structured sober housing. Third is employment and training, which is critically important. Fourth is linking people to federally qualified health centers so that they make sure, by virtue of the new Federal Health Care Act, that they have access through Medicaid to health care. And last is we have a partnership with the New Jersey State Bar Association to help people address the past legal wreckage of their lives. So again, this is a model that was designed in Hudson County, Jersey City, where we linked employment training with addiction services with housing. We now include health care and most importantly, legal services that addresses the past wreckage. And we're expanding it to 4 places in the state of New Jersey. And as Michael said, Governor Christie and I say we agree on one thing. I said that's enough. I'm going to take that as this is at least a Democratic audience. No, but in any event, thank you, Michael. That's it.
Thanks, Governor. Mr. Warner, I'm going to turn it over to you and the work you're leading in Montgomery County.
Thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon.
Ask you to move the microphone a little closer to you, if you wouldn't
Sorry.
mind. Thanks.
Can you hear me better now?
Yep.
Good. So I'm just going to spend a moment trying to tell my story because I'm doing too many things to be able to directly tell you. But I'm a former scientist who God has called back to the ministry in communities where that are more like the ones from which I come. And so when I left pharmaceutical world to come back to come into ministry, I wound up in Baltimore City, where I really encountered what the reality was among so many who are struggling with incarceration and all the things that come around it. Mental health being one of them, drug addiction is a huge thing. And then everything that happens around the incarceration process to the community and to families. And then how, as I was in the United Methodist Church, how the churches relate or don't relate to those kinds of issues. So I spent some time doing that work, and when I started pastoring a church, I started a little nonprofit that dealt with reentry in a county of nearly a million people. But the reality was that the same issues that I saw in Baltimore were happening in a very wealthy county called Montgomery County. And so we began to start dealing with the issues of what happens to people when they return, and what forces, what jurisdictions, what leaders can we gather around the issue to help make reentry possible, to help elevate the issue so that people would recognize that folks are coming out of our local jail to someplace in your community, and we must do, as an imperative, something to help them make that entry. So I worked for a few years in government for our county executive, trying to both galvanize the faith community around this issue and to help our government relate to the faith community a bit better around doing that work. Most recently, I find myself in Montgomery County Schools, where I am working on the no entry piece that Roy described. We have disconnected youth that our schools are sending into the prison pipeline, even in Montgomery County. And so I'm doing everything I can now to focus all those efforts on keeping kids out of our system.
Terrific. Thank you, Mr. Warner. So let's start with our interactive discussion here. You have a little bit of an overview of these three gentlemen's work in reentry. We're going to bring in Mike Daniels in just a minute and talk about the role of the elected officials. And what I want to focus on with you all first is a situation in which many people find themselves who are running a reentry program or launching one, and that is they've heard about the faith-based community and the terrific partner they can be. They've heard about the volunteers, and I'm going to be Mike Thompson from a fictional program here in Springfield in a community that is fairly large, and Department of Corrections has charged me with putting together this wonderful reentry program that I receive federal funding for, and I know I've got to have partners in order to make this work, and I know that this is something that churches, synagogues, and mosques are all interested in and really need to be engaged in, and I don't have much time, and so I really think I need to reach out to Reverend Brown, because I've heard a lot about Reverend Brown. I've heard, I've read about him in the paper, I've heard about the 10 Points Coalition that he's been leading. He seems like the guy that if he's quarterbacking this with me, then I know that we're going to be successful and really hit a home run. My boss told me, though, before I just jet over to Reverend Brown's offices and meet with him, I should probably touch base with Mr. Warner, because he kind of has a sense of the community. So, Mr. Warner, I'm here just to visit with you because my boss told me to. He said that Reverend Brown, I told him I wanted to see Reverend Brown. I think Reverend Brown's really going to help make this program. Any quick advice you want to give me before I go see Reverend Brown?
Yeah, first thing I'd tell you is to begin understanding what Reverend Brown's motivation is to do the work. So much of this work is just built on relationships, and it is, regardless of institutions and positions, people have a motivation to do the work, and it's people who actually facilitate the work and who develop the policy around it and who actually do the intervention work. The other thing I would sort of warn is that not everybody who's doing the work has the same capacity to do it. So every leader comes with a different set of tools, a different set of connections, different abilities to do things for you. And because Reverend Brown is a faith leader, don't assume that every faith leader is created equally and that every faith leader has exactly the same motivation. I was shocked when I started pastoring a congregation near our county jail. And as a young, enthusiastic pastor, I said, come on, we got to go down to the prison. There's all these issues. Fits right in our gospel. We need to go down there. And I charged off to the prison to turn behind me to see that no one was following me there. Because there's a stigma at church about jail, just like there is everywhere else. There were people when I got there who told me that they were members of my church, because it's a family church and they were related to people who were in my church, and yet nobody in my congregation told me they had somebody at the local jail. So just know that it isn't monolithic. But I would also say you're on the right track, because these are the people who are naturally motivated to do something about
So,
this.
Mr. Warner, I appreciate, motivation is everything in capacity, and I want you to know I've seen Reverend Brown speak at a press conference, and he was really compelling. I saw him on the steps of City Hall, and he was passionate about this issue, and he told me he has armies of volunteers ready to work in the prisons, so he's ready to mobilize. Is that good enough to go on?
The second message I would have for you is to trust but verify.
Amen.
So the other piece of this is that the people who provide us funding are going to be looking for objective data. They're into numbers. They're not so much into stories. And unless the partners that you choose can demonstrate to you that they've been effective at the work, I would say at least question whether or not you want to partner with them.
All right, so Reverend Brown, I'm here now. I'm trusting, but I'm verifying. So let's talk a little bit about to the audience. I mean, obviously, you would be a key partner in one of these initiatives, but what advice would you give to people in the room as they are starting to have these initial conversations? What does that trust but verify conversation look like?
Right. So part of trusting and verifying, and I want to thank Brother Warner for giving me the good green light on doing some work, I guess, in Montgomery County. But if you want to have a faith-based leader at the table, you have to have someone who understands the terrain of the work. You can't bring in someone who has a lot of enthusiasm and who can preach well, but has absolutely no idea of what's going on, or does not have the openness and the willingness to learn. And he could be a part of, whatever you build, but cannot be the lead at that moment. And part of, the way that you can discover that is by checking out his congregation and who is attending his church. It doesn't have to be the biggest congregation in the community, but if it's a congregation that has a sizable number of people who have that experience of in being engaged in the justice system in this way, then you have a chance of someone who has a message that reaches those folks in a regular basis. And so I would do that first of all. Second of all, you got to check the ego. So if you go to the church and his name is bigger than Jesus' name, can I get an amen on that? Somebody. That's the person that you don't want to have. I know the tendency is to look at the size of the church and think of the success based on that, but a large church does not necessarily mean a large amount of community involvement. A lot of those churches are commuter churches. A lot of the membership live outside of the community, and they drive in and worship and they drive back out. So you really have to find those folks who have an on-the-ground understanding of the community and an on-the-ground commitment to doing something about it.
So let me ask both of you a question. I'll bring in Governor McGreevey in this too, is how to navigate a lot of these local politics. I think we've all been in situations where we know we're talking about leaders and programs and services that are really scraping together every dollar they can. You're talking about places that are running on spit and chicken wire. They heard that you got a federal grant. You got $500,000 now, and everybody, seems to have the right motivation. And then I went and I partnered with Reverend Brown. I'm not really from this community. I work for the Department of Corrections, and we seem to have a great relationship going on. And then the next thing I know, I really managed to, frankly, piss off Reverend Johnson, who is now furious at me for having really started to park my resources with Reverend Brown. How do you help people navigate, these dynamics? Governor McGreevey, what sort of advice would you give people as they try to really, in a genuine and honest way, really partner with these organizations, but at the same time try and keep everybody on the same page?
Well, Michael, I think you made the first decision was the right decision, to see the Methodist before you saw the Baptist. That was prudent. And then the AME. No, and then the Catholics. I think what we did in Jersey City and Hudson County is we broke this out. And so that our addiction training was discrete, and we invited requests for proposals there in terms of housing. We set clear delineated benchmarks. So to go to the Reverend's point is that you can have large parishes that have very thriving, robust CDCs, but at the end of the day, they're going to look at the return on a particular housing parcel that may house 15 to 20 individuals. It's outside of their mission. You have to make a decision whether you're going to include sex offenders, you're not going to include sex offenders, whether you're going to include violent criminals, you're not going to include violent criminals. So I think one of the critical aspects is that you develop relationships of integrity, of decency with all of the parties, but you have clear objective standards. And that I've had the pleasure, I have close relationships with the religious community, but I've had pastors that have been friends of mine 25 years. I said, Jim, thanks, but I want to do family reunification. I'm interested in out-of-school youth, but I don't want to do housing for this particular type of clientele. And then we have small parishes, small faith-based, that are some of our best because they're hands-on, they're committed. So I think what's important is when you set out that RFP, have clear, objective standards that can be independently reviewed and verified. And we whittled it from, originally 40, we're down to slightly over 10. And some of the best are those small, hands-on parishes where there's an individual commitment of sobriety and faith.
So I'm going to bring in Mike Daniels in just a minute, but a question for the three of you. You talked about an RFP going out. Let's work on the assumption that an RFP has gone out, and this is to provide transitional housing for people coming back from prison and in the community. We've got great partners in the faith-based community. We're all together. The awards have been made. We have our partners all set. And we think that 15 Elm Street is the right place to locate this. We have a landlord who's willing to rent to us. It's the right space. Everything's looks good. And suddenly we got a call from a city council member who lives in that area and said, I just thought I'd call before I stepped outside of the press conference. I understand that you're talking about citing this program on 15 Elm Street. What's the deal? How does that conversation go down? You want to give some advice to folks who are dealing with citing these programs?
So I guess the first thing I would think about there is to have done some pre-work, assuming that everything you do around this is political, everything. Even 15 Elm Street, because it's probably in some councilman's jurisdiction, and they may have some idea for what should happen to it, and that may be linked to some other policy. So everything you do, you have to run all the way up through your government structure and all the way down through the community to make sure that the path is clear about it. If you haven't done that work and you run into a situation like that, the first thing you need to do is to have a private conversation with the legislator, right, the policymaker, because they need to understand your passion, they need to understand your point of view, they need to understand the fiscal environment around it to begin coming to some agreement as to what can happen. When you're able to have those kinds of conversations, I think more gets exposed than you would otherwise have had a chance to expose, and some kind of agreements can be made. But my best warning for you is to make sure you do the homework first in doing those kinds of deals.
Reverend Brown, you want to speak to what that homework looks like?
Yeah, the homework really looks like the relationships and the strength of the relationships that you've built already. I was thinking about Jim's 10 pastors that he's had, and he's whittled it down from 40. It really is the core community group that you'd want to really, vet some of this information around and get them to spread that information throughout the community, because this is real. You have a site, you want to put it there, it seems ideal from your point of view, but what about the community's point of view? How does it look there? And when you have pastors who are engaged in this work, who some of these folks will be coming from or would have benefited from, a site, if it was there when they were coming out, those are the people who will be your biggest supporters.
And and you're not going to make everybody happy. I had, Oscar and Frank knows that I wanted to cite this one particular site that I just loved. It was a former priory at a Catholic church, and one woman came out and she was, like the following Monday she said, Jim, you really got to help my grandbaby. And I'm like, Lord. And she was out there, and she's a good person, but, and then I had somebody out there that had served 16 years and was talking about them. I'm like, shit. Now all of a sudden it's them? What about we, us? And I was just like, and it's just like, I'm like, are you for real? And I didn't like it, I just like, grace. But so you're always going to be, and I think that's what Michael with CSG and that larger conversation, this is us. It's not them, it's not we, it's us, and it's changing that dynamic. And so I think what Michael and Rev said is 100% true, but you've got to understand that we're in a business that there are those in every community that will make our constituency a whipping post for whatever reason, and it's hurtful and it's painful, but I think we're on the side of the angels.
All right, we're going to turn to Mike Daniels, who works for someone who's on, at the end of the day, the side of the budget, and needs to make sure that everything balances. And Mike, I would love it if you would just give the group just a quick sense of Commissioner Brown and her real effort to make sure that there's a welcome home package that people receive.
Sure, absolutely. First, Mike, I want to thank you for calling on me. I started to feel like Ben Carson at a GOP debate. But I am
then who are we?
I'd point out, Governor, that you're center stage. So I have the luxury of being the policy director or the chief of staff for an elected official, the chairman of the Board of Commissioners in Franklin County. And so she has been the champion for both reentry efforts for quite some time, and then for the last 2 years for the CSG Justice Center Stepping Up initiative that's gone off in Franklin County. So I've had the luxury of working for her and being the guy who's sort of boots on the ground. She is the person who sets the direction, and then we in her office carry it out. But directly to your point, Mike, in terms of saying welcome home, one of the things that my commissioner is very big on is realizing that these aren't numbers, these aren't slots, these are people. And so if you come into our office and tell us how many slots you can fill and how many training classes you can do and all of that, I will happily escort you out until someone comes in with a program that tells me how many people we can help. So that's a big part of what we do in our office. And she walks the walk. We banned the box. The first thing she did was hired somebody to work on our floor who previously would not have been eligible to work on our floor. She didn't hire him because he was a returning resident. She hired him because he was the best guy for the job who happened to be a returning resident. So you have to kind of work for somebody who does that. We hand out a resource guide to every single person who's discharged from either one of the Franklin County jails. It's about 20,000 people a year. It has our office address, my email address, and my phone number on it. So we hand that out directly. We work with the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections so that every single person who returns to Franklin County on the day of their release gets a packet mailed to them of resources. It also comes, the first thing in that packet is a letter from the county commissioner that says, welcome home. And the second thing behind that letter is a voter registration card. So those things are not related, by the way. But I think it's really important that you have somebody, Mike, who is an elected official who's out in front of the issue, who can lead by example, who not only can help sort of blaze the trail for you as you're coming in, but also give you cover so that when you do go to Reverend Brown, but really tick off Reverend Smith, if it gets really ugly, you can just call the commissioner and see if she can't help broker that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well said. So, Mike, can we turn to the issue of local funding, which is going to be so important to really help support a lot of this work. I know a lot of programs out there are debating about when the right time is to approach their county commissioners or New Jersey freeholders and in California supervisors, but that issue of when's the right time to approach, I worry that if I approach you too soon, you're going to tell me about creating government obligations and FTEs. I worry if I approach you too late, you won't be interested. What's your advice for these different program administrators who want to make sure that the ones who write the budget are actually invested in that program.
And this is my advice, so you get, it's worth what you paid for it. But I think the worst thing you can possibly do to an elected official is surprise him or her. So I say when you have the opportunity to go forward with the program, that you find that elected official who falls in that 25 or 30% category that we saw from question 9, and you engage him or her early in the process. The worst they can do is tell you, go away, formulate this, and come back to me later. Though I think the worst thing you can do is get too far down the road and then go to them when they can say one of two things. Either you've got this off the ground and you don't need me, or why didn't you include me in this from the beginning? So I personally think that you go to them early and often.
Good advice. Let's go back to Mr. Warner. Governor McGreevey talked about some of the organizations that have best mobilized, but haven't necessarily been the large churches or large community-based organizations, but some of these smaller organizations. I referenced the program I'm trying to launch in Springfield. I work in government. I'm a little bit nervous about some of these small organizations that I don't know if they can comply with all the government regulations and paperwork. And at the end of the day, my job, keeping it, depends on surviving that next audit. What do I do to really make sure that that place that has the right heart, the right interest, but doesn't necessarily have the infrastructure to comply? What are some strategies there?
So thanks, Mike. I think you've asked the right question. A call and passion and energy and the ability to preach does not an executive director make. And what we are talking about are business entities that have to do real business work at the end of the day. It's not about just the capacity to reach people. It's not just about transformation of folks. At the end of the day, what funds the work that we want to do passionately are all business perspectives. So you need to understand how to deal with a balance sheet, and you need to understand what it means at the end of the day to have audits, and you need to understand that the very hand that is handing you funds to do the work is staying attached to you by virtue of the fact that they handed you those funds. And if you're not careful, your mission, your passion can be completely taken over by the funder. And you're going to have a relationship with everyone who hands you a dollar. And it is easy for someone who is not aware of how the nonprofit system works to get overwhelmed by that. So I think what we need to do is to help governments encourage nonprofits to build capacity. And there's some things that we can do in the nonprofit community and on the government side to do that. Basic training on how to do this work is very, very important. More important, I think, is linking smaller entities with larger nonprofits that have proven that they can do the work so the capacity gets built. And I think the best way to do that is through sharing work on real projects, on big contracts. Funders now, outside of government, I don't know the governments are doing this very much, are almost demanding partnerships. We have far too many nonprofits, all of them doing great work in little tiny spaces. Some having great capacity and others who have less. But the reality is until the smaller nonprofits build the capacity to do work with larger contracts, they're never going to grow. So I think if you're a small nonprofit, you need to figure out with whom can I link to build my own capacity to do larger work.
Great advice. Governor McGreevey, you've been actually putting those partnerships in place. Can you talk a little bit to the group about what that looks like?
I think part of it is to go to what Tim said, part of it is identifying available pots of money that exist. So, for example, in Jersey City and Hudson County, and I should say, in the interest of full disclosure, Governor Byrne, a great governor of the state of New Jersey, says when he dies, he wants to be buried in Hudson County so he can stay active in Democratic politics. The back of the room is still getting this. But on a serious note, it's identifying the pots of money. So when you talk about addiction, one of the great virtues of the Affordable Care Act is it provides for monies for behavioral health care and understanding the importance of accessing those dollars. On transitional housing, understanding the importance of accessing general assistance for transitional housing dollars. Employment and training, working with your local State Department of Labor, your one-stop, as well as your Federal Department of Labor, Department of Transportation. So I think one of the things that we've done, and Frank can speak to this. Frank, why don't you wave your hand up there so everybody can haunt you after. I get on the Amtrak. But I mean, the point is this, is that we're linking various pots of money that are in existence. And so I think through the wisdom of the Hudson County freeholders and working together with the city, we've got a great dynamic program that provides for addiction services, housing, employment, legal services, and linking with federally qualified health centers. But it's understanding all of these different pots of money with their conflicting rules, their conflicting qualification criteria, and we have it all in one stop. So when somebody comes to 398 Martin Luther King in Jersey City, boom, they have all those services. When you come to Prince Street in Newark, you have all those services. When you go to Patterson. So what we've tried to do is take these disparate county, federal, local agencies, put them under one roof, and be advocates for our clients, and I think that works. And so at the end of the day, when CSG or DOJ comes look at our numbers, the reason why our numbers in part are so strong is we make it simple, we make it readily accessible for our clients so they're not schlepping around all over Hudson County or Essex County trying to get these disparate services on a one-way bus ticket. So we're really in the advocacy business, in the social delivery business, to make their lives work.
I think one of the things that you heard was so interesting. I mean, at the end of the day, as we all know, we're talking about small grants that can only serve a small fraction of the need. And you want to engage some of these partners that we're talking about, but they're small contracts. And what I thought was really interesting was this idea of bundling the dollars, as you're saying, in one place, so that they're the recipient of the federal grant, and then they, in turn, are working and partnering with some of these other organizations, rather than lots of small grants without one accountable organization, without one organization helping to build that capacity. It's
and to go back to what
strategy.
Reverend Brown said earlier, it's also working with the faith-based community, because a local AME church may be working on family reunification, another church may be dealing with out-of-school youth, and so understanding that they're discrete, we all build to each other's strengths to create a larger, stronger, more robust collaborative.
So I'm going to come back to Mike Daniels in just one moment. Before I do, to you, Reverend Brown, back to the program that I'm running, you have a wonderful, dynamic woman who works for you, who's been a terrific asset to the program that we've been working with. But this is exhausting work. And she's got kids, she's got other obligations, they're growing up, and she's just decided that, the toll this job is taking, frankly, the money that it's paying, she needs to move on to something else. And so I'm dealing with lots of turnover with the people that we're working with here. And, there's a real specific skill set that we need. What can we do?
Tell her to apply to CSG.
What can we do, Reverend? Because we all know this is about the quality of the people that are working with these folks. And so what is it that we can do to really retain and really develop these terrific people who are so committed on these issues?
Right. And it is. I mean, when we're talking about looking at the whole of society and the ills that are in our communities, this work has always been labor-intensive, time-consuming, and can take a lot out of you. And we learned this the hard way in Boston, because it's just very easy to get so involved that you get burned out and then that's it. We didn't do a good job in succession planning. Once we moved on, and once the police officers I was working with, for example, became superintendents and chiefs and et cetera. But I would say there has to be some space for training and ongoing education, but there also needs to be a very clear understanding as to how to maintain one's personal and mental health in all of this. You have to provide that space. Not doing so it'll be just like a mill of people just coming in and out, coming in and out. So you have to sort of build that capacity to have people take care of themselves, or making sure that they take care of themselves, and then have a clear succession plan in place so that the sustainability, can be maintained. You have to have a plan for someone to come in and to be able to learn and to understand the dynamics of the work, so that they can replace the person, just keep it stepping.
I suspect after this panel, there'll be a lot of people who are going to find out they can move to Boston and work for you. So it's very well said.
We do that
over
prayer,
to
right?
to Mike Daniels. Mike, Roy Austin, in kicking off the session, talked about the data not being what we'd like it to be. You talked about having to make sure that we keep this about people, but we also know at the end of the day, at commissioner hearings of county commissioners, at legislative hearings, people want to know what's been the impact of your program. What kind of data do you have?
Right.
And we talked about how hard it is just to cite the program, to retain the staff, let alone conduct a pretty impressive evaluation. What's your advice to programs who just don't have that kind of real empirical research assembled, but are nearing the end of their grant and want to make sure they can keep it funded?
I think that you're going to have to make some kind of an investment to at least pull together that high-level data, Mike, for sure. The advice I can give you for those of you who are in the room who've just recently received grants is start collecting the data now and collect it all the way through the program. And if you don't know what data you need, collect everything. You can always toss it out later, but trying to then go back and trying to retroactively reproduce that or compare records between the jail, the mental health organization, the homeless shelter, and all of the other entities is extremely time consuming. So the time to start thinking about renewing your grant or the time to start thinking about going to your commissioners and looking at what the long-term sustainability of your program is at the very time that you get the first grant. I can't stress enough how important it is to start collecting that from day zero.
Good advice. Mr. Warren, did you want a last word there? Go ahead.
Sure. Just as a little bit of encouragement around that, the one thing I've been able to bring from my career in science is that what I learned in the laboratory was to design the experiment with the outcome in mind, right? So you're able to, when you design the work, think about the data you'll need to collect beforehand so that at the end of it you can report the outcomes that you want to report. The same thing applies to this work. As you get your contract from your government grant, even before you do that, you design that with the outcomes in the contract so that you'll know what it is you'll have to deliver going forward. It helps smooth out how you design your programs, and it helps smooth out the relationship on the tail end when you have to report the data in order to get the next contract.
Thank you. Can I call up our second poll question that we asked the audience on this issue? So we asked how committed are local leaders. We asked earlier, how are they currently involved in your program? And you told us, most of you, that they're somewhat involved. Then the next question we asked is, not only are they involved, but are they committed to sustaining your program? And we said, are they very committed, somewhat committed, not committed, or don't know? Let's see what you said. Somewhat committed, right? Somewhat involved, somewhat committed. So I think of that saying that I've heard on a farm that when you look at a breakfast, right, it's the chicken is involved and the pig is committed in a bacon and eggs breakfast, right? So we know that we've got people involved, but they're not necessarily fully committed. If you've heard,
Does that mean we need more pigs? Is that it?
I do want to say to this terrific panel that I think they've given us some wonderful advice about how to further involve our local leaders and really get them committed to sustaining it. Please join me in thanking them for a wonderful discussion.